Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, senators, fellow JCs, honorable judges, and guests. When we first heard of the speech topic, leaving your footprint, I really had to rack my brain. But then we had a handout encouraging us to just BS for 5 minutes if necessary, and my first thought was that growing up on a farm, you learn to be careful where you leave your footprint. So from there, I actually got lots of ideas. Your business footprint, your ecological footprint, the footprint on the imaginations of the next generation, for example. This was rapidly followed by writer's block and trying to pick one, until I actually realized that they're all so connected that I can only really hope to sort of touch on them tonight. You can leave your footprint in so many ways. Today's economy shows a lot of negative effects of big business handled poorly. In my business, I've often helped clients trying to get service from companies they have contracts with, but we've been openly told that not only can they not help, they can't refer us to anyone who can. I'm sure we've all heard that one. But I remember one where they not only said that they couldn't take a legal action letter at that address, they couldn't give us an address where the company would accept them. Anyone who's ever been in business knows that wouldn't have worked if push came to shove. But it was the bulldozer effect of trying to intimidate the common customer, which is the main staple of the economy, that was the problem here. The policy may reduce the costs of dealing fairly in the short term, but the footprint it leaves on anybody that it walks on isn't really going to encourage more business. I don't know if anybody else caught any of the country music awards, or if that's just a redneck thing, but it was on while I was working on this, and there was one song in particular, Shutting Detroit Down, that purported to be written for the average person, and it spoke of a lot of big banks and buyouts and securing CEOs while people further down the chain lose their jobs. And the problem with that is fewer buyers mean fewer customers for other businesses as well. Now, I've done business with a signed contract, and I've done business with a handshake, and the handshake seems to be getting fewer and far between. And while unfair business practices may not be the norm in our society, they're still common enough that most people can't take the risk of entering into a business arrangement without the contract. To be honest, I think that if the present economic downturn isn't an example of what can happen if you have policy taking precedence over fairness or even common sense, then I'm not really sure what is. I think it shows that people, or even groups of people, with any amount of power, need to be careful about what footprint they leave. The ecological equivalent of this can be seen in previous generations of environmental policy around the world, companies and governments alike. Industry of 100 years ago would have had a heck of a time if they had to deal with the issues we have to deal with today. Harvesting animals to extinction, oil spills, smokestacks that are unfiltered, dumping directly into waterways. Sure cheaper, sure easier, horrible footprint. Now we weren't there, but we still all breathe more pollutants. We still all have to cover up or wear sunscreen. And we still have to be careful what's in the water we drink, all because of a policy that might have been easier at the time, but it didn't make it right. Now, we've also heard lots of talk about our carbon footprint and leaving that behind and trying to minimize it. But it's not just the carbon footprint, it's the whole ecological footprint. For example, recreational use of quads or dirt bikes might leave a pretty minor carbon footprint compared to most vehicles, but they can still tear up grasslands or swamplands which would otherwise feed animals and produce clean air. And of course, we've all heard the 3 R's, reduce, reuse, recycle. We'll come back to that. On the other hand, there's recreation such as horse riding or mountain biking or hiking. You get lots of fresh air and scenery. You barely leave any footprint. Planting forests, protecting waterways, conserving species saves the environment not just for us, but for our next generations as well. In contrast to the business example, I've previously worked with nonprofit organizations, and when they could no longer afford to hire help, I worked with them for free, just because it seemed like the right thing to do. Without being asked, they managed to show their appreciation, and to be honest, I think I've grown from it too. I've definitely profited, just not from a money sense. Now, how are these all connected? Well, it's kind of easy if you look a little under the surface. A good business footprint, can only be left by good business practices. When the economy is going well, business, governments, and people alike have more money and more resources with which to make their choices. People without enough money might not be able to afford the environmentally friendly options. In an unstable economy, are you going to buy that new vehicle that's more fuel efficient? Or maybe it's as simple as not being able to afford to buy the groceries except for the ones with the cheaper packaging, even if it's not as recyclable. In today's economic downturn, we're now seeing the recycling plants, told you we'd get to that, on our continent being quite backed up. In some cases, they're no longer even paying the deposits on the materials that are turned into them. there isn't as much of a call for their products either, because when there's less demand for everybody. So in a case where they're no longer actually paying the deposit on the materials, someone who's just lost their job might not be able to afford to make the trip. So into the garbage can, and then into the local landfill it goes. More environmental problems means fewer raw resources, and more government money spent on them. We all make mistakes, but we need to think about it. If we care for the environment, then it can sustain more usage. Having more resources is good for business. Dealing fairly with each other in business can encourage more faith in business, which is good for the economy. And thriving economies mean more people employed and able to make the environmentally friendly choices. So to sum up, actions in one area may leave your footprint in many areas. And in conclusion, we all leave footprints in many ways, and we can all choose to take care which footprints we leave.